The Vietnam War was a conflict between the Communist government of North Vietnam and the government of South Vietnam with the help of the United States. The Vietnam War had millions of American citizens serve that our older generations are very familiar with. Whether being in Vietnam or in the home front, it left different interesting experiences in people's minds. Charlie Lopez, my dad, had an interesting perspective on the home front as well as having his father serve in Vietnam.
I was about 8 years old, um, and it was in the Vietnam era, and my father was in the Air Force, and we were living on a U.S. military base in the Philippines, and my father was assigned to a base in Vietnam, at Cam Ranh Bay Air Force Base, Vietnam.
Cam Ranh Bay was an Air Force base located on the central coast of South Vietnam. It was a major supply entrance point as well as a big transport home for aircrafts. His father spent 1 year there, so I asked him what he did.
He worked in the legal field. He worked as a paralegal and was involved in the legal aspects of not just Cam Ranh Bay, but all the U.S. military forces in Vietnam at the time. So it was a legal system that the Air Force brought with it to basically allow the Air Force and the American personnel to function in a foreign country. So it was actually pretty complicated.
By being a paralegal during the Vietnam War, his father had experienced many tense moments that were at the military base in Cam Ranh Bay.
He was there, I believe, during the Tet Offensive. Who had undergone rocket attacks and mortar attacks, but it was never overrun by Viet Cong, because it was actually pretty well defended base because that's where all the airplanes came in. And so if the United States couldn't continue that supply line, they had no way of continuously supplying all the military operations throughout the rest of Vietnam. And they had ships, of course, but you needed to land big airplanes, big C-5s. These are big giant airplanes, or C-141s or C-130s. These cargo aircraft. You had to have a constant supply of. You had to have constant air corridor open, because if that got cut off, you couldn't get men in, you couldn't get men out, you couldn't get equipment in, and so the base was really well protected in terms of being. There was no one who could. No, you couldn't overrun it on the ground.
Yeah.
Viet Cong couldn't climb the fence.
Yeah.
But they could shoot mortars and rockets into the base from the surrounding areas, which is what they tried to do.
The Tet Offensive did not only affect the military bases where supplies and equipment were, but the Viet Cong also launched attacks on over 100 cities and towns in South Vietnam. From hearing events that his father told him, my dad also had his own perspective during the Vietnam War back at home.
I was born in the Philippines, but right after I was born, and my brother was born about a year later, we actually then moved to Texas.
And that's where another base was.
In Bergstrom Air Force Base. So we were at Bergstrom Air Force Base in the '60s, and in Texas, near Austin, Texas, and that's where I actually grew up as a young kid.
While being in Texas as a kid, my dad not only just experienced living on a military base, but also had first-hand experience on living through the Cuban Missile Crisis.
We were actually at Bergstrom Air Force Base during the Cuban Missile Crisis, in which, because it was a big bomber base, B-52s were all stationed there, and that was when, for example, the U.S. and the Soviet Union at the time were really getting sideways about Cuba and the missiles that were being implanted in Cuba. And we were on high alert. If a nuclear war would have broken out, one of the first places that the Soviet Union would have lobbed some nuclear bombs and been right on top of us, because we were living on the base.
My dad also experienced watching the major TV networks about President Kennedy, as well as what was going on in Cuba at the time.
I remember the TV, and I kind of vaguely remember a lot of news, and Kennedy was. It was on the news pretty much all the time. All the networks were That was basically all they were talking about. Yeah, what was happening, the blockade, the Cuba, when the U.S. put um, ships and blockaded Cuba to prevent the Soviet Union from delivering warheads there. I mean, it was pretty tense. It was very, very. And I remember Kennedy getting assassinated too. Yeah, I remember that. I remember my parents were. Well, everyone was like shocked, and I remember the TV was on all the time, and I remember watching TV, and they had like a drawing of Kennedy's head, and the news anchor was like pointing, yeah, the bullet went in here, it came out here.
As my dad grew up in Texas, he not only had the experience of living through events on the military base, but also had interesting events that had to do with propaganda in America when I asked him about the knowledge he had of communism as a kid.
I remember when I think I was in first or second grade, they would show us movies in first and second grade, and the movies would be about. I remember this movie actually. Now it's coming back. This movie where they showed what if communism won, and they showed the movie, and it would be like, oh, a Russian invented electricity, a Russian invented airplanes, and you can't have any money, or I mean, it was pure propaganda aimed at like first and second graders, and it was so over the top that even as a first or second grader, I remember watching that going, this is ridiculous.
Now, going back to the Philippines where my dad and his family stayed while his father was serving in Vietnam, my dad experienced the effects of Vietnam and how it impacted his daily life.
When the planes would land from Vietnam with the wounded, and they would form big buses. The planes would land, then a whole bunch of buses would be greeting the planes. They would load the wounded onto the buses and then transport them from the flight line to the hospital. There's a big hospital at Clark Air Force Base, and I remember like playing Little League baseball, Little League football, and the buses would drive by because we would practice next to the road, which is on the route. And I remember practicing and just seeing like row after row after row of buses go by with the wounded, and you could see them. And the ones who weren't wounded were sitting in front, kind of sitting up with bandages on their head. And then there were sicker ones who were toward the back of the bus, and they were lying down. You could see them all like their heads wrapped up and arms wrapped up. And we just got used to it, and we adjusted. But we thought it was normal, quote unquote. But obviously, now that I think back on that whole, it was almost a surreal experience. Like, that really was far from normal.
The last big memory that my dad remembered was Operation Baby Lift. During the 1970s, this event during the Vietnam era was the U.S. government's plan to transport Vietnamese orphans out of their war-torn country into America.
I do remember Operation Baby Lift, when a lot of orphans from Vietnam, who were civilians and part of the children of the Vietnamese, who were allies. When the Viet Cong took over, a lot of them were killed, and a lot of parents tried to get their kids onto the departing U.S. planes. They just would take their kids and put them on the planes and just know that they would get to the United States and be better off than if they were staying in Vietnam. And a lot of parents would never see their kids again.